for our seminar this afternoon. Just a quick introduction for Mr. Toby Mendel. He is the founder and executive director of the Center for Law and Democracy, which is an international human rights NGO which provides legal and capacity building expertise regarding foundational rights for democracy. From 1997 to 2009, he was senior director for law at Article 19, an NGO focusing on freedom of expression and the right to information, which is very sought after nowadays and something we miss more so than not. And he has collaborated extensively with intergovernmental actors working in these areas, as well as numerous governments and NGOs in countries all over the world. He's the author of a large number of articles, monographs, and books on a range of freedom of expression, right to information, and communication rights issues. I don't think there's anywhere he hasn't been. We had a discussion earlier in the week, and anytime there was an invitation to visit a different country, he was like, "Yeah, I've been there. I know the situation." So a lot of expertise in that regard. And today our seminar will be centered around the theme of identifying human rights violations in your community. So human rights as a very international issue within our small or medium communities and how to identify them. So I'll leave the stage to Mr. Toby Mandel. And throughout the seminar, if you have any questions, uh, write them into the chat and we'll try to get to them as best as we can. Other than that, I hope everyone can get something out of today's presentation. Toby, we're with you.
Okay, great. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, I guess, depending where you are. I'm going to assume that quite a few of you are in Ontario. Um, so yeah, so the topic for today is identifying human rights violations in your community. I am going to I've got sort of three different parts of the presentation. So the first is really kind of an overview of different types of discrimination and how they may be manifested. So that, I mean, I think discrimination, if you're in Canada, discrimination is probably the main way in which you're going to experience human rights violations. It's not like in some countries, where you might get killed or something like that. But I mean, discrimination is a serious matter, but it's not as serious as some other things. Then I'm going to present the UN Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes and look at the common risk factors that the UN has identified. So that's a more internationally oriented part of the presentation. I won't spend too much time on that, but of course, if you have questions, please ask them. And then I will move on in the third part to focus on speech issues, and with quite a bit of focus on hate speech and how the rules on hate speech work under international law and also in the Canadian legal system. So the first thing I'll look at is the grounds for discrimination. So what are the features of a person that give rise to a prohibition for others to discriminate against them? And if we look at Section 1 of the Ontario Human Rights Code, which is the key document, that legal instrument that sets out the rules on discrimination, that sets out the prohibitions on discrimination, you see there in the bullet here a long list of grounds: race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, and so on and so forth. So a lot of different characteristics. What you don't see there is, for example, political outlook. So, for example, discrimination on the basis of your political views is not the same as some of these other characteristics. The rule prohibiting discrimination applies generally to services, goods, and facilities, and I'm quoting that. So, for example, if you go into a corner store and they won't serve you because of your citizenship or your sex or your sexual orientation, that would be a prohibited form of discrimination. Then the code also elaborates the anti-discrimination rules in a number of other specific areas. For example, accommodation, contracts, employment, and participation in vocational associations or unions, as they're commonly called. So these are sort of specific examples of the general prohibition on any discrimination with respect to services, goods, and facilities. That's the general one, and there are some more specific ones. Those prohibitions apply generally, but there are cases where you can have a bona fide requirement. So you need somebody to have a certain characteristic so that they can receive that service. For example, Kezi mentioned that I've been to all of these different places, so I fly a lot. And when I fly, I like to sit in the exit row because there's more room in the exit row, and you can kind of stretch your feet out. But when I sit in some of the airlines have a prohibition on people sitting in the exit row if they're over 65. So that is a form of discrimination based on age, which is prohibited. You can see age is listed as one of the characteristics up here. But of course, you need to be strong and fit enough to throw the exit door out of the plane so that people can get out of it. I think that to my mind, a hard ban on anyone over 65 probably would not be accepted in Canada because not everyone over 65 is unable to throw that door out. But of course, they do need somebody to be fit enough to do that job. So that's what we would call a bona fide requirement. Of course, even within that, and that example I gave you, but even within that, employers particularly have to accommodate your grounds, if it were. So there was a very famous case a long time ago. A Sikh who used to wear a turban worked for CN Rail, and he was working out on the yard, and he didn't want to wear a hard hat because he wanted to wear his turban. So the CN Rail terminated his employment because they said, no, you have to be wearing the hard hat. That's a safety requirement for us. And the matter went to the Human Rights Tribunal, and the tribunal said, yes, of course, it's legitimate to require the hard hat to be worn on the grounds where work is being done when something could hit your head, but you can accommodate this person by giving him a job inside. He doesn't have to be on the grounds. You can find another job for him, which uses his skills because CN is a large employer and they have a lot of capacity to accommodate. So even though bona fide requirements like wearing a hard hat, like being strong enough to throw the window out of the plane door, you can impose those, but you have to accommodate within that. So it's a strong and robust system of protection. And it also covers constructive or systemic discrimination. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. Discrimination by association. So even if you are not, one of these grounds that I have listed here, if you're being discriminated against because you are associated, for example, you're married to somebody from that, or your friends come from that group, and you're being discriminated even though you're not part of any of these characteristics, that still would be a prohibited form of discrimination. And you don't have to actually discriminate, even if you have an intention to discriminate, and you might manifest that intention by, for example, talking about it.
Sorry,
So,
Toby.
yes.
I'm sorry. I'm just getting Reggie in my ear. Could
Yeah.
you possibly put the presentation in presentation mode? Would that be, it's the button right beside the Zoom
Yes, I
toggle.
know where it is. Is there is there a particular reason for that? Because I kind of like to see the next slide.
Okay, you like it? Okay, no
Uh,
problem. It's just better
Is,
visually, but no problem.
is
Go
it
ahead.
large enough for you to see the slides?
I think we can try and enlarge it, but yeah, if you're fine with
Yeah,
this, that's okay.
I kind of prefer to do this way so I can see as I'm talking to this slide, I can see the next slide coming up, if
Okay.
that's all right. Um,
Already on top. Go ahead.
uh, so, special programs, affirmative action, or DEI, as it's often called these days, which are aimed to take a group that's historically disadvantaged and create equality for them. So to privilege a disadvantaged group, those are not considered to be discrimination because they are, even though they privilege a certain disadvantaged group, the overall aim is to bring that group into equality with everyone else. So even though they look like they're discriminating favorably towards a certain group, the overall aim is equality. Also important to consider multiple grounds. So if we go back to the list, there we see race, ancestry, sex, and so on. Many people have more than one of those characteristics, and so they may be subject to multiple forms of discrimination. And the term we use for that these days is intersectionality, quite a common popular term. And it doesn't matter whether you belong to a certain group or not, if the other person thinks that you're part of that group. So, for example, I'm not a Muslim, but if somebody thought I was a Muslim and started discriminating against me on the grounds of religion, that would still be discrimination, even though I'm actually not a Muslim, but because they had that perception. So it's based on the intention or the perception of the person that's committing the discrimination and not sort of actual facts, as it were, if that makes sense. Race is a very important ground of discrimination, so you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. But actually, modern theory holds that race is not actually a scientific thing. There's no scientific thing such as race. Like there isn't. It can't be defined in scientific terms. But it is a very real social construct. So people think that there's such a thing as race, and may discriminate on the basis of it. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. I mean, obviously, age is a scientific fact. You were born on a certain day, and you are a certain age. Sex, in the biological sense, is a fact as well. But race and some of the other characteristics are less so, but it's based on the perception of the person or the social construct surrounding them. And of course, a lot of other characteristics may relate to race, for example, language, color, diet, clothing, the list of them there. And just to note that, I mean, normally when we think of stereotyping and discriminatory behavior, it's usually stereotypes are negative. But even positive stereotypes, if acted upon, can constitute a form of discrimination. So it doesn't have to be negative. Citizenship is generally not relevant to the areas of discrimination. So you can't discriminate on the basis of citizenship for employment or accommodation, for example. Obviously, you can check whether somebody has the legal right to work, for example, here in Canada, but that has a little bit to do with their citizenship, but that's a legal phenomenon that exists apart from citizenship. So if you're a permanent resident or you have some other right to work in Canada, that's all the employer can ask, not your citizenship. But there are 3 areas where citizenship may be taken into account, where it's not discriminatory to take citizenship into account, where the law requires that. So there are certain positions, for example, where you have to be a citizen by law. So obviously those can be taken into account. Where the service that's being offered is part of a system to promote culture or sport for citizens or permanent residents. So permanent residents are in the same basket as citizens when it comes to that. And also, in some cases, for the chief executive officer, it's legitimate to to require that person either to be a citizen or have an intent to become a citizen. So those kinds of areas are it's permitted to take citizenship into account. When it comes to creed is the term in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Some other codes use the term religion. They're basically interchangeable. And that applies broadly to both well-recognized and emerging religions, and also sort of sects or subgroups within a religion. So discrimination on the basis of your religious affiliation, more or less, however that manifests itself. And the key test here is if the beliefs and practices are sincerely held and or observed. So if the person, actually does believe in the religion, that's the test. But it doesn't include secular, moral, or ethical beliefs or political convictions. As I mentioned, political convictions is not a prohibited ground for discrimination. So so I may have a moral belief, that it's immoral to drive a car because it's bad for the environment. That's not a prohibited ground of discrimination. But atheists or agnostics, so non-religious beliefs, are also included. So if you discriminate against somebody because they're an atheist, for example, you refuse to hire them because you only want to have religious people, believers in your working for you, that's a form of discrimination. And when it comes to religion, I would say there are two key attributes to the prohibition on discrimination. You can't try to force somebody or pressure somebody to change their religion. And employers must accommodate religious beliefs. So, for example, if you want to have a day off because that's a religious day for you, normally the employer should accommodate that. You need to ask for it, so you need to tell the employer and ask for the accommodation. And the employer has to accommodate you unless it causes undue hardship for the employer. So, for example, if you work in a very key position in a very small organization and they need you there every working day of the week, and you ask for a day off because of a religious holiday, then they may be able to refuse that. Okay, when it comes to forms of discrimination, like how discrimination manifests itself, it can take many different forms. And I mean, obviously, direct discrimination on a prohibited ground. You refuse to rent an apartment to somebody based on their ethnicity, for example. That's clearly a form of discrimination. It's direct, it's immediate, it's connected. The issue here is that it's often hard to prove. So, for example, you try to rent an apartment and you're not accepted to rent it and it gets rented to somebody else. You may feel that it was because of a prohibited ground, because of your ethnicity or your religion or your age or whatever it was. But it would be difficult to accumulate the evidence to prove that. Usually, unless the person that's discriminating makes a comment which manifests their discrimination. So unless they kind of tell you that they're discriminating against you, it can often be very difficult to prove it. And that's one of the big challenges in the area of discrimination. You may feel you're being discriminated against. You may be correct even, but it may be difficult to to muster the evidence for that. Other forms, I mean, if you impose extra burdens on certain groups, for example, you require a heavier proof of income when you're renting an apartment for certain kinds of people. That's also a form of discrimination. Profiling, so special measures based on a group status. For example, let's say you work in a large company and they have security officers, and the employer says, so watch those people, we don't trust them, kind of thing. That is a form of discrimination. Profiling. Harassment. So harassment is defined as a course of vexatious comment or conduct. So things that that upset you, that you don't want to happen. Somebody keeps making comments about your gender, for example, or your race. And the test for this is an objective test. It's not whether the person was personally intending to harass you. It's whether their behavior is such that a reasonable person would understand that it's harassment, so that it's unwelcome, that based on these characteristics. And when it comes to employers and service providers, of course, they have to avoid discriminating themselves, but they also have an obligation to investigate complaints about discrimination, for example, in the workplace. So it goes beyond simply not discriminating themselves. An employer has to make sure that their workplace is not, characterized by discrimination. And that can take the form, for example, of a poisoned environment. So an environment, for example, where although technically women can get employed, but it's just not comfortable for them to be there. There was a big case many years ago in Canada, for example, about trucking. So if you look at sort of truckers, most of them are men, and the truck employers didn't have a problem hiring women, but the whole environment in the trucking world was such that it just it's not a nice place for women to work because it was very masculine, very male oriented. So the case held that the trucking associations and the trucking businesses had to take measures to address that. They had to kind of deconstruct the toxic male environment that made it difficult for women to work as truckers. And so coming back to the systemic form of discrimination, systemic discrimination is putting in place conditions which tend to exclude people from certain groups, even though they're not intended to do that, but they just have that, that tendency. For example, if you are in a work camp environment, so working on a railway where people have to live and work in the location that they're working, and you refuse to prepare halal food for Muslim workers. So that's you're not doing that specifically to discriminate against them, but it makes it difficult or indeed impossible for them to work there. So that would be a form of systemic discrimination. Okay. Any questions or comments on that part of it? So that's the sort of discrimination within the Canadian context, sort of the grounds and how you may recognize it. Does anybody have a comment at this point? I can't hear you, Yazin. No. Okay, this. Is it better? Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So, aside from being litigious and suing someone, what's after we've recognized the form of discrimination, what's another way to kind of redeem ourselves or make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else
Right. Okay.
in our community?
I mean, you can go to court for discrimination. Obviously, it's quite expensive and time consuming and difficult for people to go to court. Most people don't have the wherewithal, if I could put it that way, to do that. And also, by the time you get a remedy, like, for example, let's say somebody doesn't rent you an apartment on a discriminatory basis, by the time you get a court decision about it, it's going to be a year or 2 years later. I mean, that doesn't really help you in the accommodation space. So we have across Canada, in every jurisdiction and including at the federal jurisdiction, human rights bodies, human rights commissions, and human rights tribunals. So those are administrative bodies. They're part of the public sector, but they're independent from the government. Indeed, you may want to bring a complaint against government for discrimination, for example. And they are very accessible. They don't cost anything, and you can lodge a complaint there. They will investigate and process the whole matter. And if they find discrimination, they will deal with it. They have various powers to address the cases of discrimination, including ordering the party to not discriminate, providing compensation, various measures like that. So basically, these are administrative systems that are much more accessible and hopefully much more rapid in resolving matters than a court. So there's a specific structure for that.
Perfect. That answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to go on now, and I'm going to shift spaces entirely. So we're talking now about atrocity crimes. Atrocity crimes are very serious international crimes. Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, those kinds of very, very serious crimes. Of course, very serious patterns of discrimination would also qualify as atrocity crimes, but not, not the sort of minor kinds of discrimination, not minor, but sort of less serious forms of discrimination, like denying somebody an apartment is not an atrocity crime. That, the discrimination has to be at a much higher level than that for an atrocity crime. Hopefully, atrocity crimes don't take place in Canada. And those are very, very serious matters, which we hope that in our country don't happen at all. But they certainly do take place in a lot of other countries. And the UN has developed a framework of analysis for atrocity crimes as a tool for prevention. So these factors are things that you look at, essentially before atrocity crimes become widespread, and then you can perhaps try to address the situation. So this is really a set of analysis for countries that are having pretty serious problems, and how you might recognize the emerging signs of that. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because of time. So the first issue that you would look at is conflict within a country or other forms of instability. For example, humanitarian crisis, which may be human generated or natural, a drought, for example, economic crises, mass protests against the state, sort of forms of instability. Serious human rights or humanitarian law breaches, so there are already patterns of abusive behavior going on, and especially, for example, if those things take place with impunity, so people engage in human rights abuse and they are not dealt with by the state, that's a clear sign. Weak state structures. So if the state, the state structures are not operating properly or not strong enough, a legal framework that doesn't protect human rights, weak national institutions, lack of an independent judiciary, weak oversight bodies, corruption, weak state structures. The presence of general motives or incentives for these kinds of crimes. For example, consolidation of political power, consolidation of economic power, so concentration of power in one group to the detriment of other groups. Where there's a perception that threats are posed by certain groups. So in some states, they blame a minority for the problems in the state, those kinds of things. So I don't know why this is 7 or 8. I think I might have. Sorry, I think I might have lost a slide here. Anyway, enabling circumstances or preparatory actions. So, for example, if the state passes an emergency law, or puts in place special security measures, interference with independent bodies or civil society organizations, where the security apparatus or the support for the military is overweight, where there's too much focus on that. Triggering factors, so sort of triggers that may unleash atrocity crimes. So, for example, sudden deployment of security forces, perceived interference from the international community. Some states, the international community, we need to do something inside. Abrupt or unconstitutional regime changes. Incitement or hate propaganda, we're going to get onto that. Elections, often an instability factor. Group tensions or discrimination, so serious patterns of discrimination, which may then boil over and become atrocity crimes. Denial of the existence of groups, for example, where a state says that a certain group doesn't exist at all. Serious tensions or conflicts between groups. And then finally, signs of an intention to destroy a group. So, obviously, if there's any evidence that there is an intention to destroy a group, then that may actually turn into action to destroy the group. Here's that other slide. Sorry, got in the wrong place. Capacity to commit the crimes. So, arms and financial resources, transport and distribution systems, a culture of obedience to authority. These are signs that things might go wrong, and the absence of mitigating factors. Lack of empowerment processes, lack of civil society, lack of affiliation with intergovernmental organizations. So if a state is kind of very isolated, the risk of these things happening is greater. And then there are some other risk factors here. Okay, so those are some of the warning signs that that a state is in a precarious position, and that the advent of atrocity crimes might be imminent. Anyone have a question or comment about that? And then we're going to move on to the speech part of it.
To all our listeners, just a reminder that you can always put in questions in the chat, and at times like these, we will always go back to them and try to answer them as you have them. So nothing gets left to the very end of the presentation.
Yeah, please do. If a question comes up, just put it to me. Okay, so we're going to shift gears again, and I'm going to focus now. I mean, often the clearest sign of a risk of discrimination or more serious human rights abuses is in the speech space. We monitor things that are being said, and it's through that we can tell that there are risks to us. Or indeed, as I said before, I mean, if you're being discriminated against, often the only way you will know that is because of something that's been said. There will often not be other forms of evidence. And I just would mention that, I mean, in the speech space, there's a range of possible speech acts which are unhelpful but not so bad, or ranging to very, very toxic speech. So, for example, people may, because of stereotypes or prejudice, make uninformed comments, but they're not hostile. They're just ignorant, basically. That can still contribute, for example, in a workplace, to a negative environment, but it's probably easier to address than more motivated stereotypes. And then, hostile but mild stereotypes, for example, somebody may say, "Oh, Canadians are boring." That is not a nice thing to say, but it's not very toxic or harsh. I think we can accommodate that one. And then hostile stereotypes ranging from more than mild to very harsh. And then finally, at the top of the pile, the most harmful kind of speech is what we call hate speech. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about hate speech, and under international law and Canadian law, what is hate speech. I will say that in different legal systems, there are a number of legal means for addressing hate speech or seriously biased speech that falls short of hate speech. So in many countries, as in Canada, we have criminal bans on the most offensive forms of speech, hate speech. In many countries, you have a civil right to recover harm caused by hate speech. So somebody engages in hate speech against you, and you suffer harm, you can bring a civil case and get damages. So that's different from the criminal process. The human rights codes in a few jurisdictions in Canada, they have hate speech. So just somebody doesn't deny you a service or refuse to employ you or give you accommodation, but they just say something. In some jurisdictions in Canada, that is considered a form of discrimination. Only a couple of jurisdictions. There's been quite a legal battle about that in Canada in the past. Ontario does not have that in its human rights code. There are emerging requirements for platforms, social media platforms, to block illegal content. So, hate speech as legally prohibited hate speech, that they will be required to block that. There are emerging requirements for platforms to conduct due diligence against harmful acts. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end, especially in Europe, where they have the most advanced system for that. And then many countries have heavier penalties for hate-inspired crimes. So mostly those hate-inspired crimes are not speech-related, so they, somebody assaults you, for example, but heavier penalties for that. So, if you commit an assault, you may get a certain term of prison, and that may be more if it's motivated by hatred. Also mention that many media have professional standards that they are, that they set for themselves, and or that may be quasi-legal if there's a legal backdrop to them. So, for example, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, all of the broadcasters in Canada belong to the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, and they have an equitable portrayal code, and if somebody breaches that code, you can complain to their oversight system, and they will have a process, and it's a bit like a human rights tribunal process, an administrative system, and they will sanction the broadcaster if they breach the code. And the standards here are often much higher, much more stringent. In other words, broadcasters commit not only not to engaging in hate speech, really toxic speech, but also, and you see the standards there, refrain from airing unduly negative portrayals of persons with respect to, and you see the list of characteristics, race, national or ethnic origin, and things. So not just not engaging in hate speech, but not in negative portrayals. Negative portrayal, according to them, can take different forms: stereotyping, stigmatization and victimization, derision of myths. So, for example, if a community believes in something and the broadcaster is derisive of that, derision of myths, traditions, or practices, degrading material and exploitation. So the standard that the broadcasters set for themselves is much higher. They're basically not supposed to say anything nasty based on these characteristics. So they're making a strong commitment to equality. Okay, so looking now at international law in the area of hate speech, and Article 22 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, is the leading international treaty setting out civil and political rights, including speech protection. And Article 22 of the ICCPR says any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. So it's an interesting case because it's one of the only examples of international law requiring states to ban speech. This is an obligation on states that are parties to the ICCPR. This kind of speech, you have to ban it. That's what this says. And it's one of the only examples of that. And Article 19.3, so Article 19 of the ICCPR protects free speech. So that's the one that guarantees free speech. And Article 19.3 allows for restrictions on speech, and the test for that is set out here. The exercise of the right provided for in paragraph 2, so those are the protection of free speech, carries with it special duties and responsibilities, may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but only that are provided by law. So the restriction must be set out in a law, and are necessary. So necessary is a high bar, high standard, to protect the rights and reputations of others. So when we talk about hate speech, we're talking about equality. That's a right that everyone has. So we can restrict speech to protect equality, and hate speech is exactly an example of that, or for protection of national security, public order, or public health and morals. So as I said, it's really the only case where the ICCPR requires states to restrict speech. Otherwise, states are permitted to restrict speech, but they're not required to. This one is one where they're required. So it illustrates the importance that the international community gave to the idea that hate speech needs to be banned. I mean, this is a slightly legal part here. I'm going to skip over this, but basically, Article 19.3 says you can only restrict speech if you meet these standards. And Article 22 says you have to ban this kind of speech. And international courts have, naturally enough, held that they're compatible with each other. Okay, so there are 6 key elements in Article 22. The first is it prohibits advocacy, and that is generally understood to be intentional. So intentional speech, advocacy of hatred that is based on nationality, race, or religion. I'm just taking these from the words of Article 22, that constitutes incitement. And the incitement is to discrimination, hostility, or violence. I'm going to unpack all of these, and that shall be prohibited by law. So, sorry, intent is when it says, states shall prohibit advocacy of hatred, that means intentional. And there's, you can see here, and I think we can share the slides with people after the presentation. So, you can look these things up if you're interested later on. And there's, those are just examples of cases where courts have held that indeed intent is part of the thing. So if you, unwittingly engage in hate speech, I mean, it's not very easy to do that, but if you did that, then you would not be guilty of hate speech. So hatred is a key concept here, and of course we call it hate speech, and the word hatred is embedded in the definition. But actually, interestingly, hate or hatred in this context has never been defined in international law. And the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said, implementation of hate speech rules is weak, partly because of the lack of clarity on key elements of the law, such as the definition of incitement, hatred, and hate speech. So, this key notion actually is not very well defined in international law. And there have been some courts have sort of made some language to try to define it, but not very well. One of the better definitions, in my opinion, comes from the Supreme Court of Canada, which had a case on this. And it said hatred in this sense is a most extreme emotion. So, it's not just bias or stereotype or dislike. It's really hatred that belies reason, an emotion that, if exercised against members of an identifiable group, so if you hate them and you exercise that hatred, implies that those individuals are to be despised, scorned, denied respect, and made subject to ill treatment on the basis of group affiliation. So we're talking here not just, a dislike or a stereotype or a prejudice, it's hatred. It's really something strong. So, under the ICCPR, the grounds for hatred are only race, nationality, and religion. It's a very short and narrow list. And if you remember one of my early slides, I had the list of grounds of prohibited discrimination in the Ontario Human Rights Code, a much longer list than just those 3 items. So that's under international law. And I think, we have to look at the time that the instrument was adopted. In 1966, it was drafted, shortly after the Second World War, and race, nationality, and religion were seen as the key, areas where hatred was being manifested. But nowadays, I mean, we have a much longer list, and every country that has rules on this goes beyond these 3 characteristics. For example, gender or sex is an obvious one, sexual orientation in many countries, and so on and so forth. But I think, again, important to point out that it doesn't cover viewpoints. So these are characteristics which are essentially immutable. So, you can't, you are a certain nationality, you are a certain religion. Of course, you can change your religion, but it's a very deeply held thing. You're not going to easily change your religion, so it's fairly fixed. But your politics, one day you could be a conservative, and the next day you could be a liberal. Your politics can change. It's something that you own and control, and it's not covered by hate speech.
Hi, Toby.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off.
No.
It's great learning a lot. It's just I think we have a bit more of the slides to go.
We do, yeah.
Maybe if you want, we can take a break
Sure.
for that in the between the 2 parts now.
Yeah,
And
okay.
then when we get back, depending on, we can either continue on from the slides a little bit or just dive right into the conversation and make reference to the slides as we go, if you'd like.
Yep. Okay. So let's have a little break now. Shall we have a break until the top of the hour?
Yeah, sure. So, everyone who's listening here on Zoom or YouTube, we will now be taking a short break for our presentation on how to identify human rights violations in our communities. We'll be back at exactly 2.
Okay,
Uh,
sounds good. All right.
Welcome back, everyone. So we're just back from break, and we'll now continue. So I saw a lot of more slides, especially with the incitements. I saw it was like a part one and a continued. So I really want to, if you will, get back into the slides,
Yeah.
and then we'll continue the conversation from that.
Yeah, what I'm gonna do, there are a few more slides. I'm gonna speed up a little bit, so not so allow
No,
more.
but the rest I saw like it's better if we cover them. So
Yeah,
a
sure.
lot of good information there. So
Yeah,
if we can get back to yeah, thank
yeah.
you.
Okay, so we were just talking about the grounds for discrimination, for hate speech, sorry. Um, so one of the key elements of hate speech is that the speech must incite certain things. Um, and incitement is kind of a complex, and I say a controversial concept here. I mean, there are a few slides on that. Really, the essence of the idea here is that there's a very close relationship or connection between the statement and the risk of those things happening. And the things are discrimination, hostility, or violence. We'll get to that in a second. But I mean, so, it's not, the statement must essentially directly lead to those things happening. And I mean, incitement is not exactly the same thing as causing something. So you can incite without the thing happening. It's not a direct causal relationship. But if you look at the court cases, they really do look at causation. For example, we had an important case from Canada where a teacher was a racist and was active in racist activities outside of the classroom. And the Supreme Court of Canada, which ultimately heard the case, said it's possible to reasonably anticipate the causal relationship between the statements made by the person and the poisoned environment in the school. I mean, there was a racist environment in the school, and the Supreme Court said yes, it's linked to the statements this person is making. So that's the kind of thing that they look for. Context is also very, very important. So not just the statements, but the sort of the who the speaker is and other contextual factors. So, for example, the fact in the case I just mentioned, the fact that it was a teacher as opposed to somebody who worked in a not with children, for example. Children obviously very sensitive and susceptible to these ideas. In Faurisson, which was a case from France. So in Faurisson, the person had denied the existence of the Holocaust, basically said that's a fabrication, didn't happen. And looking at the case, the Human Rights Committee, the body that applies the ICCPR, said, in France, the denial of the existence of the Holocaust is, in fact, the principal vehicle for anti-Semitism. That is how anti-Semites are expressing their anti-Semitism, and this is an example of that. So, and then there were two cases from Turkey, which I think the contrast between the outcomes in the two cases is interesting. So in Zana, the person who made the statements and was convicted of hate speech was a former mayor in a town in the southeast of Turkey where there was a lot of conflict and things, and the statements coincided with murderous attacks in the area. So they said, okay, there's the link between the statements and these attacks is clear. In contrast, in İnkol, another case from Turkey, the person lived in Izmir in the other side of the country, in the western side of the country, and the person had made some quite strong statements, but the court held this person just not that connected to these issues and not responsible for them. So that they didn't incite the hatred. Tone is also relevant. Yeah, okay. So the way you express yourselves and the form, for example, in some of these cases, the person was a poet. So you write poetry. I mean, who reads poetry? People who are reading poetry aren't likely to get insight. Go out and commit violence against people, but if you're, giving a speech in a public square, then maybe the incitement would be more likely to happen. I'm just going to stop. There's a question here from YouTube. Canada has laws against hate speech, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Black racism. But if online attacks, yeah, okay. So that is a very, very good question. So hate speech, as this person has appreciated, hate speech is really only a narrow band of the very most toxic and insightful speech. Most of the content that you see on social media, even though it's very, very biased and hostile, but doesn't rise to the level of hate speech. I'm gonna, if with your permission, I'm gonna come back to that question because it's a very important question, and I'm gonna look at what the Europeans are doing, which is an approach which I very much support. Unfortunately, mostly only the Europeans so far have done that. So I'm gonna sort of bracket that and come back to it. Okay, so you have to incite to, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, discrimination, hostility, and or violence. Those are what we call the prescribed results. So violence, we know what violence is. Discrimination, we were just talking about that in the first part of the presentation. It's an act where you deny somebody something based on their group characteristics. Hostility, though, is just a state of mind. Hostility is, a mental state in which you are biased against somebody. You don't like that person simply because of their characteristics. So that's quite different than discrimination and violence. And that one, I would say, is the more sensitive part of the whole thing. So if you incite other people to hate a group, but they don't do anything, they just hate them, that's like a mental state, that already falls within the scope of hate speech. Prohibited by law, so generally that's understood to mean a criminal law, although, as I mentioned before, there are various forms of legal remedies, including civil remedies for hate speech in many countries, but mostly countries which have hate speech laws, they are criminal in nature. It's important to have some protections, not to overban hate speech, not to unduly restrict freedom of expression when prohibiting hate speech. So, for example, there are 4 special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, one at the UN, one in the OSCE, one in the Americas, and one in Africa, so in the different human rights systems. And they made a joint statement in 2001 about hate speech, and they said no one should be penalized for statements which are true. So if you say true things, even though it might stir up hatred, you're still allowed to say it because it's true. No one should be penalized for the dissemination of hate speech unless it's shown they did so with a specific intent of inciting. So the intent part that we talked about before. The right of journalists to decide how best to communicate to the public should be respected, including when they're reporting on racism and intolerance. So, for example, a journalist may, report on hatred. They may quote, for example, some things that a racist has said. They're not themselves engaging in hate speech. They're telling everybody, hey, look at this. This kind of thing is being said in our society. So they should be left to do that. Prior censorship should never be used as a vehicle for addressing hate speech. So you don't stop things before they're said. You sanction them after they're said. And then sanctions should be proportionate. That's a key principle of international law. Even if you restrict speech, the sanctions should be proportionate to the speech act. So that's fairly, fairly uncontroversial, I would say. I don't know if anybody disagrees with that, but these are protections for speech which need to be in place when banning hate speech. So, as mentioned by the person on YouTube, through the YouTube channel, Canada has a number of prohibitions on hate speech. It has a specific rule on advocating or promoting genocide, which is punishable by maximum 5 years in prison, and you need the Attorney General's consent to prosecute. So that's one. Section 319(1), publicly incite hatred where it's likely to lead to a breach of the peace. Okay, so that's I mean, it is protecting equality, but the primary aim of this is to protect the peace. In other words, you don't want to incite a riot. It's a 2-year offense for that, and you need the Attorney General. Oh no, sorry, the Attorney General's consent is not needed to prosecute that one. This is the most direct hate speech provision, Section 319(2), sub 2, willfully promotes hatred via a public statement. So, that one doesn't need to lead to a breach of the peace. It doesn't need to lead to anything. You're just inciting others to hatred. And then 319 sub 2.1 willfully promotes anti-Semitism by condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. So you're denying the Holocaust or you're minimizing the Holocaust, but you're doing it with a specific intent to promote anti-Semitism. So that's another one. And they all of these have strong sets of defenses. So truth is a defense in Canada, in line with the special rapporteurs. You can, it's a defense to say that you were giving an opinion on a religious topic. So basically, you can say whatever you like about religions as long as you don't incite to hatred against the believers of the religion, but you can say things about the religion. It's a defense if the comment was relevant to a subject of public interest and the discussion of which was for the public benefit, and you reasonably believed it was true. So even if you say something that isn't true, but you reasonably believed it was true, and you did it to contribute to a public debate. And you intended to point out matters producing hatred with a view to removing them. So if your intention is not to incite hatred, but actually to address hatred, then that's a defense in Canada. So, fairly sensible defenses. The next few slides are on the Online Harms Act, which seems to have disappeared. It was a project of the previous Liberal government, so I will skip that. And I am going to talk now just a little bit, and these are my last few slides, and then we can open up for discussion about the EU Digital Services Act. So the Digital Services Act came into force in November of 22, so just 3 years ago. And it's a very significant regulation by the EU of platforms, such that we don't really have anything like that in Canada, and indeed in most countries. And part of it is about requiring platforms to take down illegal content. So platforms generally are not responsible for the content that's on their platform. If I, as a Facebook user, post illegal content, whatever it is, Facebook is not responsible for that. Facebook's not liable, even though Facebook is disseminating that content. They're protected against liability. In the EU system, once somebody notifies them of illegal content, so somebody says, hey, Facebook, that Toby Mendel posted something illegal, then they have to take it down. And if they don't take it down, they're responsible for it. So that's an important part of the Digital Services Act. And they have a bunch of rules around that. For example, there's complaint systems. They have to be transparent about the content. So if somebody says, oh, that comment by Toby Mendel's illegal, take it down, and Facebook takes it down, I can then complain and say, hey, no, that's not illegal. It's legal. Please put it back up, and whatever. There's a whole system for that. Okay, that's one part of it. So that would apply to hate speech as it does to any other kind of illegal speech. Of course, what's illegal varies from country to country. So, what the EU, what the platforms have to take down, I mean, they may tailor the takedown simply to one country if that rule only applies to that country. And even, for example, hate speech rules vary from country to country. Okay, but the much more interesting part of this, which I think is very, very, potentially very, very powerful, and it really going back to the question that the YouTube user person asked earlier, what can you do about this nasty stuff on the platforms that's not wise, that doesn't meet the level of hate speech? So for very large platforms, those with 45 million users or more in the EU, and last time I looked, there were 17 or 18 of them, they have to conduct annual assessments of significant systemic risks from the use and functioning of their services. So we're no longer talking about illegal speech, we're talking about risks. And those risks are okay, illegal content, but also negative impacts on privacy, freedom of expression, the prohibition of discrimination, and the rights of the child. So prohibition of discrimination, basically biased speech, discriminatory speech, stereotypical speech, hostile stereotypical speech, that is all covered by this. And the platforms have to look at, what is flowing over our system and what are the negative impacts of that. Not what's illegal and legal, what's the impact of our operations. And they also have to look at intentional manipulation of their service, including by means of inauthentic use or automated exploitation of the service, which has a negative impact on things like health, minors, civic discourse, elections, and public security. So there's a list of areas of negative impact, and those areas certainly include equality and prohibition of discrimination. So they have to do an annual assessment of that. And as I mentioned, it goes way beyond illegal content. They have to look at the impact that they're having on society. Facebook, we have however many million users in Europe. What is the impact of our service in these areas? Are we undermining privacy? Are we hurting kids? Are we promoting discrimination? What's the impact? So it goes well beyond hate speech. Then, when they identify those risks from this assessment, they have to put in place reasonable, proportionate, and effective mitigation measures tailored to the system. And the DSA, the Digital Services Act, has a list of types of measures. And the interesting thing is, if we think about states, when states address speech, they can put you in prison, they can, convict you without putting you in prison, just, then you have a criminal conviction. They can fine you, they can require you to compensate. They have only a very small set of tools, if you will, basically punishments, and only a few punishments, basically prison, warning, fine. And there's not much else, that the legal system can impose on you. In contrast to that, platforms have, an endless series of measures that they can impose. For example, they can put a red flag on it and say, this is hate speech. That's a measure they can do. States can't do that, right? They can put a flag on your speech. They can demote your speech. They can stop spreading it. They can, minimize the spread of it. They can, stop recommending your speech to other people. They can direct readers to other sources, which present a different view of the thing that you're talking about. So platforms have much more, a much wider panoply of measures to take to address bad speech, if you will, or speech which causes harm in society. So the DSA says, figure out what you're doing, what the impact of your service is, and then mitigate those harms. So if your service is promoting discrimination, stop it. Figure it out, do it yourself, figure it out yourself, but do something about it. And the regulator will assess whether, first of all, the assessment was proper, like you did a proper assessment, or you just did it like a quick job. And then secondly, whether the mitigation measures are strong enough. And if it doesn't find the mitigation measure to be strong enough, it can take measures against the platform, including, in the end of the day, to impose very, very heavy fines, up to 6% of their worldwide turnover, not their profits, their turnover. So it's they have a big stick if they want to use it. We're still in the very early days of this, so we don't know how effective it will be. So far, it seems that the regulators are being fairly easygoing with the platform. So the first round of assessments have been done. The first round of mitigation measures have been proposed. And the regulators are more or less accepting all of that. The regulators haven't said, no, this is not good enough, do it again, or put in place stronger measures. So that, I would say that in the first round, they're being kind of easygoing, letting the platforms, do their business. But it's early days, and they may well, step up as we go along. Yes, so somebody's asking whether the slides will be sent to attendees, and yes, I believe that we can send the slides to attendees. I'm certainly happy for that to be done. So the European DSA, in my opinion, is a very interesting new approach to trying to address the harms that are being caused by platforms, and especially social media platforms. And we'll just have to kind of observe how that system plays out. I expect there will be legal challenges, and the European Court of Justice will probably, in the end, have to rule on some of this, and who knows what'll happen by that. It depends a little bit how the regulators behave, but it's very dynamic. It's a very sort of happening system right now, and it is it's the first time anyone has said, okay, enough with this harm that's flowing from harmful racist and hate speech and non illegal speech, but harmful speech on the platforms. We need to protect our societies against this, and the Europeans are doing that. I'll stop with that. I have a couple more slides looking at the human rights analysis of that, but and just to say that my email is there at the end of the slides, which will be shared with you, and you're very welcome to, if you have questions or comments on these slides or my presentation later on, you're very welcome to email me. Over to you, Kazim, and we can have a discussion now.
Yeah, that was very informative. On behalf of everyone listening, I'd just like to start off by saying thank you. It was a very enlightening speech as well. Started off from Canada, see what we could have had happen locally, and then moved to the international stage. As you know, most of our listeners and viewers, they may be from international communities, so it is of interest to them to see what kind of remediation there is in regards to if their if their countries back home don't act quickly towards discrimination or hate, or if they portray it themselves. It's good to know that there are international bodies that they may go to. And on top of that, being some of us being newcomers here to Canada, it's important to know that there are things that we can do, and we don't have to just sit back down, act oppressed, and just have to take
Absolutely
it,
not.
just have to take it. So it's very good for us to know that there are steps that we can take. So on that note, I guess we could start off maybe with a um, deeper dive into Canada's discrimination laws, and like in terms of our own communities here, sometimes a big question that comes to my mind is that sometimes communities uh, conflict within each other in Canada. So maybe from a broader respect, it could be all Turkish people, but they may be conflicting on a different note within themselves. And unfortunately, this doesn't always just result in dialogue and people talking it out. Sometimes it can result in like online attacks or something where people slander you or stuff, something like that. So, in regards to Canada's space, if something like this happens within a community, what do you suggest we look at first, and what we try to act upon first in our attempt to kind of just reduce this kind of discrimination?
Yeah, that's a very good comment, and I mean it's a little bit complicated because, of course, you know, you mentioned Turkey, for example. I mean, Turkey's a very large, complex country socially and in terms of the dynamics, and the bodies that exist in Canada may not understand very well some of those dynamics that you were just talking about, because I mean, people come to Canada from every country in the world. They just not that, they're not, they can't understand the sort of sub-national social dynamics from every country in the world where we have people in Canada. So it's quite a bit complicated, I would say, for them. And I mean, I think that would point me to the first step, is that if you, I mean, obviously, at a first level, you might try to resolve it within the community. I mean, if you can, and you know that there are multiple ways you might do that depending on the structures and systems and organizations that exist within your own communities. But if that's not working, and you feel the need to engage with Canadian human rights protection systems, if I can put it in a very general sense, I mean, I think the first step probably would be to try to raise the awareness of the human rights bodies, so the human rights commissions and tribunals, about those dynamics, because they probably don't understand them that well. And
Hmm.
so kind of having a dialogue with them, I mean, just calling them up and saying, look, we're having these problems. Can we talk to you? And then, kind of presenting them with some information and, whatever. I mean, I think that would be, and I mean, you can have a specific complaint before the human rights commissions, about a form of discrimination, and they will investigate like it's a case, like they're sort of a mini court. Obviously, they operate differently from a court, but they will deal with that as a case by case basis. But they will also, do community outreach work and dispute resolution work that's much more general in nature. Because I think what you were talking about was this idea of general frictions within some communities, if I can put it like that. So I think reaching out to them, and trying to engage them in that business, as it were, and trying to see what they can do. And I mean, what they can do will depend a little bit on their resources and their, how seriously they view the matter and all that kind of stuff. But I think that would be a good first step, because they certainly do have that mandate, and they have resources for that, like community work, basically, in the end of the day.
Really, that's perfect. And one, especially from the end, with the online submissions, and considering that, for example, I myself have two kids, and they're online. They will be. They're very young now, but they will be online more than I was in my life, and so in terms of just protecting themselves, their mental state, you mentioned that Canada is a bit lacking in comparison to the EU for protecting against hate speech online. But regardless of how small it is, do you have any suggestions for the very common citizen to kind of get that up and running and make sure that we can protect the online lives of our children and for the future?
Yeah, I mean that's a very so I have three kids that are older now. So I went through all of that I mean, not that long ago, but the world is getting more and more complicated online,
Yeah.
with AI and all kinds of weird and wonderful and distortive things. Um, I mean, I think I mean, as at a more general level, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it's not good for kids to spend too much time on their devices, their phones especially. That seems to be the favorite device for kids. I personally, I hate my phone. I only go online on my computer. But I mean, so I would say, like in my case, and I mean, this might sound a little bit oppressive, but I didn't get my kids a phone until they turned 9. No, until they were in grade 9, so they were 13.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean everybody else had a phone by that point, and my kids were, very frustrated at not having it. But I don't regret doing that. So, and when we did that, we also limited the time that the kids could spend on the phone. Uh,
Okay.
it's like, they shouldn't be like that all day long. It's not a good thing for them, and there's a lot of evidence of that. And of course, schools across Canada now are increasingly dealing with phones as well, right? I don't know in Ontario, but here in Nova Scotia, for example, kids are not allowed to use their phones in the classroom. Um, so,
Mm.
they have a system, and if the kid doesn't respect that, they take the phone away or something. I don't exactly know how it works, but in terms of protecting them specifically from content, I mean that's a challenging dilemma, because on the one hand, you don't want to kind of be over controlling and restrictive of your kids, and secondly, they will probably be more, not just they'll spend more time on their online than you did, but they'll probably be, not at the very beginning, but quite quickly more sophisticated digitally than you are. So
Mhm.
you might try to impose some controls, but they'll have a better sense of how to get around them than you do to impose them. So I mean, just like for me as a parent, that wasn't a relationship I wanted to have with my kids, where I was controlling them all the time. It's not a nice way to interact with your kids. I mean, what I did with my kids was try to educate them. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. Don't go and find it.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt you, and don't be excessively curious, and don't go looking at stuff that you shouldn't be looking at. And I kind of left it up to them, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I mean, another part of this, which is slightly different from this conversation, but also an important human right, is on the privacy side. So, people don't, especially kids, but even adults don't really think about their privacy carefully online. You put it out there and you can never take it back, right? You put whatever it is you put out there, a picture, a comment, or whatever, somebody can grab it and take it, and you don't own it anymore. You don't control it anymore. You cannot, you can remove your post, but if somebody's grabbed it, they've got it, and you can't get it back. So, basically what I said to my kids was, I said, if, I mean, think before you put stuff online. If you don't want to be looking at it in 20 years, don't put it out there. And of course, I know it's not, like kids want to be free and easy and whatever. They don't want to be thinking carefully all the time and, whatever. But I think it's important for kids to think about that. It may not seem sensitive from a private point of view to them at that moment, or they may think, oh, I'm only saying it's my friend or whatever. But kids need to think about their privacy and,
Mhm.
not put stuff out which they don't want to be looking at in 20 years, basically. So those are my recommendations.
Okay.
They're on the soft side of things. It worked with my kids, I think, pretty well. Um, but every parent just has to kind of play it by ear and see
Right.
how it's going.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. That's the kind of the tightrope you gotta walk
Yeah,
when you're
yeah.
parenting. That's definitely true for everything.
Well,
So I
that's
just
that's true.
I
And I mean, and also, I mean, the online space is changing, right? It's not the same as when
yeah.
kids were young. It's more dangerous and more hostile than out there today than it was, like 10 years ago when my kids were young.
Yeah.
Whatever.
And it's definitely like in the aspect of it's much more different than anything beforehand because
Right.
just with a post or liking something online, our kids may have liked the wrong person's post and now they're suddenly on the list for a government, no-fly list or something. Even that, like
Yeah, possibly.
yeah,
Possibly.
so.
That's yeah.
It's kind of frightening. But there's always a way that you can get after it. So
Yeah, I mean, I
hopefully,
would I would say, I mean, that's enough. You're raising another point. Is like,
yeah,
people just like things without thinking
yeah,
or whatever. Think about what you're doing. When you like something, you're lending your weight to it.
yeah,
You are actually liking it, and that means something. It's not just
yeah,
kind of, people want to interact and they just like things so that they can like something because they're bored and they want to do something. They should, people, including kids, if you're liking something, it's because you actually liked it. Think about what it is before you like it. If it sounds a bit nasty, don't like it.
yeah,
You know, like,
yeah,
hate, racist and hate speech is, the nastier side of it. It's fairly clear. It's not that subtle, right? Most of it.
yeah.
It can be, but I mean, yeah.
So I have another question, but before I get like back and forth, I just want to remind all the attendees that if they have any questions, please pop them by, and then we'll discuss it here, and so that it becomes more interactive. And but I do want to ask another related to the previous community question that I had, more government agency this time where let's say an oppressive regime, any kind, any across the world, or its officials, through embassies or even like clandestine organizations that they created here in Canada spread hate and fear against the community that they've oppressed and even exiled out of their own country, but now want to keep going after. What options do people in Canada have to push back against someone like a government or a regime or officials within Canada?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to distinguish between the embassy and its
Hmm.
operations and other actors.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that, they may create organizations in Canada or whatever. I mean, those other actors, even though they may be sponsored by the government, they're still just private actors here in Canada. It's
Okay.
an organization or something like that. And they're subject to, the Canadian anti-discrimination rules and anti-hate speech rules and all that kind of stuff, just like everybody else. So the Human Rights Commissions, for example, you can go to them and complain about those sorts of activities, and they can take action against it. When it comes to the embassy, it's a little bit more complicated because there are special rules on protection of embassies. Embassies are, the representatives of a foreign sovereign state in Canada, and we have treaties and international law rules about how we have to deal with them and the respect that we have to pay to them and that kind of thing. And you might have heard about this whole business of parking in New York, where all of the diplomats are illegal, the UN diplomats are illegally parking, and then finally New York started giving them fines and stuff like that because they, but normally they're, and even if a member of an embassy commits a crime, they cannot be convicted here in Canada. So there's a lot of restrictions on how we can deal with them. Ultimately, if they are, and of course, Canada wants to have good relations with other countries and things like that. So it's going to overlook some stuff, even though it doesn't like that stuff, but it's not going
Yeah.
to, a thing. And I mean, there's been this whole thing about foreign interference in our elections, and a lot of that's taking place through embassies and through official consular services and things like that. Coming officially from China and India were the two countries that were most directly pointed out for that. And but ultimately, I mean, Canada can take action. It can expel diplomats, for example. It can certainly engage in bilateral conversations with the state if it's undertaking activities in Canada, which we don't appreciate, as it were. And discrimination is certainly something that we don't appreciate as a country in Canada, whether it's from within Canada or from outside. So I mean, I think Canada has very strong values on that. I mean, the commitment to equality in Canada is very, very strong, and I think Canada is more committed to that than among the from all of the states in the world. Canada is one of those that's more committed to that value, which is a good thing, of course. So, I mean, I think you can try to get some diplomatic action when it comes
Yeah.
to the embassy, but obviously, Canada is not going to engage in diplomatic discussions with every state about every issue.
Hmm.
It would wear out the positive relations, as it were. So, I mean, you have to try to, you know, make a strong case and make a convincing case.
Okay. Would you say like Canada's MPs and the parliament itself is open to communities expressing themselves and making sure that Canada is aware of their side of the story so that it doesn't just take the embassies or the consulate's word on its own?
Absolutely, and you can work through your own. Like if something's taking place in a certain riding in Canada, the MP who represents that riding, I would say you should certainly raise it with them, and at the national level, but also at the provincial level, because you have provincial MPs as well, and potentially even at the city level if it's happening within a city, for example. So you have three levels of government, all of which have elected representatives, all of whom are, geographically based in Canada, unlike in some countries. So uh, and they certainly can, if they get excited about something, if you convince them that it's a serious matter, they can raise it in Parliament. And they have a lot of ways that they can deal with things. So definitely.
Another question I had was, I came here in grade two, so throughout my education. I was always very um, interested in the fact that Canada has always been this small in terms of population country, but very effective in world events with like World War II. And then you have the peacekeeping missions later on within the UN and the importance Canada always gave on these values of freedom and expression and just being equal amongst all. But do you think that Canada's influence in this regard is kind of waning, or it's not like on the top of any political party's agenda anymore? Or if so, like, is there anything we can do as citizens to kind of force our politicians to get back into the Canadian way of trying to find equality for all?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I do think that Canada, um, sort of, if we go back, I don't know, 20, 30 years and further back than that, it had a, quite a strong commitment to engaging internationally. Canada is the country that invented peacekeeping, by the way. It's a Canadian product, that if as it were. And I mean, that was obviously hugely significant and has had an enormous impact on a lot of different parts of the world. And of course, a lot of the peacekeepers are Canadian, but that idea. Um, and I think that it is true that Canada has and I mean, multilateralism has also been very, very important for Canada. If you think about the geographic situation of Canada, and I mean, right now everybody's talking about it because the Americans have imposed these hostile tariffs on us, and we feel like we're in an economic conflict with them, and it's sort of our isolation, as it were, from the rest of the world, with 70% of our two-way trade going to one country. I would think that there are not many countries which have well, probably no other country which has a sophisticated economy like Canada that is so dependent on one other country for trade. Even within Europe, they're all trading, with each other and whatever. They're not just linked to one other country. So, and we're feeling, and so multilateralism, given our geography, so we only have one country that even though we're the second largest country in the world, we only have one, physical neighbor, like one country that we land abut. That's the United States, obviously, and our trade is heavily with them. So we've always looked to multilateralism as a way of kind of addressing that geographic challenge, if I can put it like that. But I do think, ironically, because of course now we're all very sensitive about the economic dependency on the US and trying to change that. But I think that we have probably diminished our multilateral efforts. I would also say that the world has gotten I'm going to say more complicated from a multilateral point of view. So if you go back, even if you go back 15 years, China, for example, did not really engage that heavily. It tried to have good bilateral relations, but it didn't engage that heavily in the UN and other systems, certainly not compared to its size. China, for example, has never been a democracy, or, never been a democracy, but it wasn't actively exporting non-democracy until the last 10 or 15 years. And now for example, it brings journalists to China and trains them on anti-democratic journalism values. It has a whole theory of journalism that's anti-democratic, and it tries to export that view to its trading partners, and in Africa and around the world and whatever. And a lot of other countries have gotten more active multilaterally as well, so that they are trying to use the international system to their own ends. So that means that Canada is sort of, whereas 20 years ago, a lot of countries weren't that active and Canada was active, so it could bat well above its weight. Now, with more people being active, it's harder for Canada to bat above its weight because it's just one player in a very active space. So I think I think Canada's pivoted a little bit away from it, but also the environment has gotten more challenging for Canada
Mhm.
to do those things. There was an interesting study done about 10 years ago, which said that, so going back 10 years and looking back 10 years before that, and the study said 10 years ago, the Western Bloc, pretty much, if they had a human rights issue, they could win it in the UN. They could,
Mhm.
pursue and get a human rights standard or development, if they wanted to, if they were determined about it, they could get it. But today, so 10 years ago, when the study was written, the rate of success. So the rate of success was, I think, 95% or north of 90% 20 years ago, but as of 10 years ago, it had fallen to about 50%. So that shows the more complicated situation that I'm talking about. So even when the West is unified and they, for example, on the death penalty or whatever it is, they can't win those battles as easily anymore. So the ability to do good things in the international system is harder today because more bad actors, more countries which are anti-democratic or anti-human rights are playing bigger roles.
Mhm.
So I think it's slightly challenging, and of course today, like talking about the last few years, Canada's, I mean, the amount of money that we're spending on defense, that, I mean, we're being forced to, stand up for ourselves, I suppose, in the end of the day, but still that's very expensive, takes a lot of effort and focus and energy. So I mean, we haven't seen it yet, but I'm watching anxiously, I would say, to look at the levels of aid that Canada is allocating. A lot of countries, I mean, the US has stepped out completely from that space. I mean, I think that's disgusting, and I think that's, incredibly unfortunate. But a lot of other countries are diminishing. It's not just the United States. A lot of European countries and other countries are diminishing the amount of money they're spending on aid. So that's an unfortunate development globally, and so far that hasn't happened yet in Canada. But who knows? It might. So I think that we should all, as residents of Canada and probably citizens, many of us, we should certainly, and voters, we should pressure our government to maintain its multilateral role, including its aid profile. Those are important things for our country, and we need to sort of be vocal about it and make
Mhm.
sure that it doesn't stop doing that.
Mhm.
We are the people of Canada, and that's our country, not the politicians.
Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely one of those things that when I was growing up made me proud of being Canadian. So I definitely wanted to continue because it did give me a sense of the Canadian ideal. And
Yeah,
I just want to
absolutely.
remind everyone that unfortunately we only have Toby for until 3. We'll try to keep him for maybe a bit more than that, but it's only a couple minutes. So if you have any questions, please shoot him on through, and then I'll ask your questions before I'll ask mine, I promise. But at the moment, we don't have any questions. So transitioning into this landscape of how you said there's an international atmosphere where aid is going down, people are more um, active on how they're trying to get their ideals across, and they're trying to kind of make sure that their ideology is being propagated. And in this regard, I also see very concerning trends. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll move on to because we don't have much time, so I'll move directly into the comment. It says, the new bill proposed by Carney's government is concerning. It clearly seems to limit Muslims, but not other religious groups. Well, do you have any comment on that?
I'm going to assume that it's the new bill on hate activities
Uh-huh.
that was just I believe it was tabled yesterday. To be honest, I meant to study it before this conversation because I thought somebody might ask about it. But didn't manage to do that because I had a crazy day yesterday and whatever. But I mean, it's not. It's completely neutral in its own language. But it does prohibit, for example, protests and things like I believe, because I've just read it in the news and I haven't studied it directly myself. I always like to study things directly, but it will prohibit demonstrations, for example, in front of religious sites and things like that. I mean, I think that I mean, I don't think it targets Muslims, but that I don't think that's the intention either, and certainly by its terms it doesn't. But for example, it would prevent demonstrations, for example, in front of religious establishments, including Jewish establishments, Christian establishments, Muslim establishments, anyone else's. It could be that more of those things are taking place today in front of Jewish religious establishments because of the situation in Gaza. I mean, we as I said, I haven't studied it. We do have, so we are a free speech organization. We fight for free speech around the world. I mean, among other things, we do have some concerns with it from a free speech perspective. Of course, freedom of religion is also important. Demonstrations and activities around religious establishments should not be threatening or, should not prevent religious adherents from participating in their religion, from going into the establishment and being able to do their things peacefully inside. That's correct. But prohibiting any protest, which could be quite peaceful and not threatening and not interfering from around a religious establishment, I think is probably excessive. There should be some conditions on that, for example, or that there should be a power to prohibit a protest in front of a religious establishment if it's interfering, but not just anyone. That would be kind of something, a subtlety that we would like to see introduced into that legislation. But I mean, I think it does. I don't think it targets Muslims, but it could be that in the current environment, because the prevalence of activities around religious establishments is more targeted at Jewish ones, given this what's going on today in the world. But we'll have to see. And there will be a big debate about it. So, I mean, I think, if you have concerns about it, read it, make comments on it, talk to your MP. We're talking about engaging with the political element. Your MP is there to serve you and hear your views and things. And if you feel that it's, disproportionately targeting Muslims, even if that's indirect, then that's certainly a view that you could raise with politicians, for example.
Yeah. To your comment on freedom of speech, have you ever found that sometimes uh, limiting people's speech or right to protest to be able to get a supposed a cleaner atmosphere in the country, it
Right.
kind of leads people to go into more extreme when they're responding after their freedom of expression has been limited? Do you ever see that in government reprimands?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I mean, one slide that I sometimes show when I'm talking about hate speech is one about the US versus the rest of the world. So the ICCPR requires states to ban hate speech, and Article 22, and we talked about that. The United States has ratified the ICCPR, but it reserved against that provision because under the US Constitution, hate speech is protected. You can say whatever you like. I mean, you can't incite others directly to violence. You can't say go and kill that person. That if that's going to be if that's effective, but short of inciting to violence, you can say whatever you like. You can, and you can find websites in the United States which say pretty much any nasty thing you can think about anybody. I mean, really, really vile, disgusting websites. And one of the arguments that Americans make is that if we ban that speech, then those people who want to engage in that speech are going to go underground and do things other ways. Exactly the kind of comment you just made.
Hmm.
If we ban things, people will react negatively, worse than just saying things. And at least if we allow the speech, we can see it, we know what's going on, we can monitor them and make sure that they don't go beyond the speech into violence, for example.
Yeah.
I think that I mean, it's not to say that some people, don't feel upset that they have been controlled and they may vent themselves in a worse direction. I'm not saying that never happens in Canada. I think it doesn't happen very much. I don't think is a big risk in Canada. I think that Canadians, I mean, of course, there's 40 million Canadians, and I don't know how many people other than that living here, another 1 or 2 million, I suppose, or whatever. And they you know, they range from A to Z in terms of their behaviors and their outlooks and all that kind of stuff. But basically, I think we have a fairly civil approach to relating to each other in Canada, and that, you know, kind of going underground and getting violent is you know, fairly exceptional. And I don't really accept if something should be prohibited because it causes harm, like hate speech. I don't really accept the argument. Well, if we stop that thing, then people are going to do worse things. I mean, if people do worse things, then we're going to, you know, put a
We're
worse
gonna
punishment.
stop that.
You know, we can't
Yeah.
not do something we should do just because people might not like it and behave badly.
Yeah.
I don't accept that argument as a theory, but I don't think it's much of a risk in Canada. I think that we are the war in Gaza, and I mean, this is a very sensitive thing, but from my point of view as a human rights activist and as an observer of the international system, the war in Gaza has created tensions and stresses that are greater than the world has ever seen it from any single incident. I mean, it is remarkable how, you know, what a lot of stress that war has put on the world. And I mean, I will, I was, I do a lot of work with UNESCO, and I was visiting, doing some work with UNESCO in one country. I won't mention the name of the country. And the head of the UNESCO office there is a Muslim person from, well, I won't mention where he's from, but from, you know, country. And you know, we were talking about this, and he said, you know, it's amazing how this war in Gaza has challenged almost every branch of the UN beyond how it ever, whatever happened before. So it is, you know, that particular event has gotten people very, it's obviously it's an extreme event. It's gotten people very, very upset, and it is putting stress on our, you know, even our reasonably civilized society here in Canada.
Mhm.
And I think that, you know, so, and the protests obviously are a sharp point of that. So a lot of protests have been removed. For example, longstanding protests from universities and the people involved in them. Sometimes, like at McGill, for example, when the protest was closed down, they went and occupied the administrative building. So exactly what you're saying, they were protesting on the grounds, and now they're occupying you know, an operative, you know, key building for the university that is, you know, going worse, if you will, or you know, reacting negatively to being shut down.
Yeah.
But they were removed from there and whatever. And, you know, I mean, that was a short-term thing. It was so I do think that it's, you know, this is just a moment in the world that we're just going to have to, you know, work our way through. Um,
Mhm.
by the way, I will mention that my organization, working with JFK Human Rights, an American organization, have prepared a very deep analysis of the freedom of assembly, the right, you know, the right to protest is falls under that right.
Okay.
Uh, and we're going to be publishing that very, very soon.
Exciting.
We're just setting up that we're just you know, formatting and designing the product and whatever at the
Okay.
moment. So look for that when it comes out, because it really looks at all of the issues around protests. And for example, one of the issues that's come up here is sort of longer standing protests. So if you think about, like, a lot of protests or demonstrations, you know, you walk down the street and it takes a couple of hours and then it's over. But these Gaza protests were, you know, were semi-permanent almost. So
Yeah.
it looks at the issue from an international human rights lens. What are the, you know, what are the considerations? At what point can you remove a protest? Obviously, in Canada, we also had the truckers' protest, which was
Yes.
another
Which
long-term
is
protest.
very semi-permanent.
Yeah, exactly. So and semi, you know, long-term protests raise different issues than the shorter-term protests
Hmm.
and things. Because I mean, one of the attributes of the right to protest is that you can engage in minor breaches of the law. So, for example, you know, walking on a street, which you're not supposed to walk on the street, right? It's for
Yeah.
cars. So that's a breach of the rules, but you're allowed to do that as part of a protest because you need to, you know, get on the street and walk down it. But you can only do it for a little while, and there's a balancing act there
Hmm.
between the disruption that you're causing, and the right to protest is a right, but it has to be balanced against the amount of disruption that you're causing people by whatever you're doing. If we look at the truckers, for example, they were utterly disrupting the whole of downtown Ottawa. You live in Ottawa, so you were
Yeah.
more aware of it than I was. But and so that I mean, the balance was way out of sync there. I mean, from the international human rights point of view, they took way too long to remove that protest. It should have been removed,
Hmm.
after a few days. And
Interesting to hear your perspective on that as a freedom of
Absolutely.
expression.
The right to protest, basically, it gives you the right to make your point within sight and sound of your target. So if you want to talk to Parliament in that case, so they were in downtown Ottawa, they were making their point in sight and sound of Parliament very, very clearly. Once you've made your point, though, you've done that, and it's time to go. You
Hmm.
can't you don't need to make your point forever. That's
Yeah.
not the right to protest doesn't protect that. And I think that some of the Gazan protests also misunderstood that point. You can you want to tell the university, you want to tell the students your point of view. So you have a protest for a few days, but then you've done it after a few days. Everybody got your point of view.
Yeah.
Now it's time to go and free up the space for the use that it was originally intended. So I think that there was a little bit of confusion, I would say,
Definitely.
about the extent
Definitely.
of the right of protest there.
Well, on that note, we are at the end of our seminar. On behalf of everyone that's attended and on behalf of Northern Justice Watch, I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Toby Mendel for giving us a very insightful and enlightening presentation on the idea of how we can track or identify human rights violations in our community. And if you want to finish off on any note, other than that, I think everyone was very appreciative of your efforts, and we really want to thank you. And uh, so we also have a comment from our executive, Mr. Sharif Aydin, who says, "My computer is dying." Technology, what we were talking about, but he says he wants to hand out a very special thank you to you for joining us today and giving us a very good presentation, very insightful. And hopefully, on behalf of Northern Justice Watch, he says the communities where we work with, which are many, I know from the work we do. We really appreciate your time and the incredible insights you shared. So
Oh, well,
thank you for
thank you
that.
very much. That's very kind of you. I don't have any really final comments. I will just say, please do share my slides with anybody who asks for them,
Definitely.
or the participants. And I guess I'm not sure if we know everybody that was on YouTube, if you have registration for that. Anyway, share those.
Yeah.
My email is at the end of the slides, and our
Okay.
website is there as well. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be very happy
Perfect.
to respond to any questions
Sounds
or
good.
comments.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
thanks, and I'm glad if it was useful, and it was kind of enjoyable discussion.
Definitely, definitely, and me personally, I really enjoyed speaking to you. And if you're ever in Ottawa, we'd love to host you. And if we're ever in Halifax, we'll knock on your door to just say hi. So thank you very
Sure,
much.
sure, sure, absolutely. And Leslie, I see Leslie in the chat is asking for other presentations. Leslie, when you get my slides, just ping me an email so that I can share things with you. Some of them are online,
Yeah,
but some of them are just like presentations that I've made that are on my computer, and I'm very happy to share them with you. I have some others on hate
definitely.
speech and other issues, so just ping me an email and ask for them.
Perfect. In regards to sharing the presentation, I'm not on the tech side of the organization, so I can't give you an exact idea of how we'll share it. It might be put on the website after if Mr. Toby lets us, or we can just email every participant separately. But I'm not on the tech side, so I won't be able to give you a definitive answer now. But definitely, since we already have the permission, we'll definitely share it with everyone that's attended today, and anyone you tell that wants to see it for themselves. And on that note, again, thank you so much for giving us this presentation. And I'd like to wish everyone who attended a very good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are, depending on where you are in the world. And hope you have a blessed day.
Take care. Bye.